Broadcasting live from the desert, this is the Monstrous Feminine Podcast, the film club where we dissect the eerie intersections of gender and horror. My name's Louisa, and I'm joined by my boys,
Tyia
and Zeba.
And this is our last episode of the month covering children in horror. We're talking about the 2001 horror mystery, The Devil's Backbone, directed by Guillermo del Toro. Mila is off sick this episode, but she'll be back soon. Before we get into the film, go ahead and follow us on Spotify, YouTube, or the Apple Podcast app. You can find all of our links on our Instagram at the Monstrous Feminine Podcast.
In The Devil's Backbone, a young boy named Carlos is dropped off at an orphanage for boys whose fathers have been killed in the Spanish Civil War. The orphanage is run by Carmen, a widow to a leftist revolutionary poet and a doctor named Casares, who is in love with Carmen. Casares and Carmen support the Republican loyalists and are hiding a large cache of gold being used to back the Republican treasury. They're assisted by Jacinto, a caretaker and former orphan, and Conchita, a teacher who is engaged to Jacinto. An unexpected bomb dropped by the fascists sits in the center of the school's courtyard. Carlos soon discovers that the children are often visited by the ghost of Santi, an orphan who mysteriously disappeared the night the bomb was dropped.
¿Qué es un fantasma? Un evento terrible condenado a repetirse una y otra vez.
This film is, it has some heavier themes, but I'm gonna do the catch up with something a bit lighter since the episode will get a bit heavy. So what are some things that you guys played with as a child or collected, since we see them collect slugs throughout the film? Did you play with bugs a lot, or like what did you guys collect or play with a lot as a kid with your friends?
They also collect comics, but you went straight to, yeah, they have slugs. You know the little roly-polies? I used to like to play with them. I used to like to lift up things and get roly-polies. But this is like when I was quite young, because like it's before I got like fearful of bugs. Not that roly-polies really freak me out now. Or ever did, but like I would be like playing with worms and roly-polies in the backyard for sure.
This is when you were in your Miss America era.
I never really did the torture worms thing.
I think you're not intended to do that unless you have some aspects of psychopathy.
But I guess like because you're told that they'll grow back, so I was like, so people would like, oh, they'll be fine.
I don't know. I played with dolls a lot. I was an intense girly girl as a child. So I collected like jewelry, like collected jewelry. I begged for my parents to buy me jewelry. And I
say what riches.
And I used to have like a ton of dolls. Like any new Barbie doll I saw a commercial for, I would immediately like cry and beg for it. I sound like a bratty child, but I mean, you know, we grow up and we move. And I would always like have my mom, my sister, my cousins or whatever play with the dolls with me. So much so that my like older cousin had like assigned names for the dolls, where we like would be like, yep, we're picking up from the story scene 2 with this doll and this doll. And so yeah, like I had my own like little elaborate doll world that I kind of built as a bundle thing.
I forgot. The question was, what did you collect? I collect ducks. I was obsessed with ducks. I still love ducks.
Oh, did you used to like the one? Oh, I used to love those fish that sang Elvis songs.
You mean like the bass on the wall?
I don't think those are for children.
They aren't, but my grandma used to have like a ton of them that sang like different songs, and that like was my obsession. I would like press it over and over and over again.
Well, that's obnoxious.
Yeah.
My dad had one of those too that sang. But yeah, no, I collected ducks, and I had like I think at one point my duck collection was probably like 800 to 1,000. I had like stuffed animal ducks, like cuddly toy ducks.
What happened to your ducks?
Well, when I moved in like when I was 13 going on 14, I moved from America to the UK, and in a crashing end to my childhood, I had to like car boot sale or yard sale my ducks, the majority of them. But also by that point I was like 13 and like at the time interested in like boys. This is before I knew I was like a raging homosexual. But like, so also like having like hundreds of ducks on the wall, like stuffed animal ducks, was like not a good look. So I was okay with them going. I think it was time. It became like bigger than me because people knew that I loved ducks, so they would buy me ducks. Do you know what I mean? Like I didn't buy all those ducks. Like adults in my life, all around me, like even a teacher would buy me ducks. Like it just became a thing. But I was like hyper fixed. I love them. And I still, if you come to my apartment, you see little hints, like I've got a little duck sketch. Zeba, did you collect anything? Wait, a fun fact here that's like a transatlantic thing is I've been telling people like, yeah, I used to collect stuffed animal ducks. And I didn't realize in the UK, you don't say stuffed animal. So people thought I was like talking about fucking taxidermy ducks. And I was like, no, I wasn't a fucking psychopath. I mean, like cuddly toy ducks. Like I wasn't a kid with like my taxidermy ducks. Like that's so
That would be
crazy.
insane, actually. Especially with 1,000 taxidermy dogs.
Yeah. On my wall. Oh my god, I would be unhinged. But anyway, I just want to make that distinction in case any listeners are also baffled by me saying stuffed animal ducks.
I collected normal shit like rocks and I don't know, little toys and such. I'm like an anti-hoarder because I've moved so much in my life. Like I used to move every 2 years of my life. I throw shit out. So it doesn't like do me very well to be a collector of things. No, I love it. It makes me feel like fresh and light and easy to have like not that much stuff. So I generally would say I'm not a collector. I wasn't like a collector. I mean, I did have things, and I would start collections and they would get pretty big and then I would like have no feelings about throwing them all away. Like, oh, it felt so freeing. I love it.
The Monstrous Feminine is on Instagram, so please go follow us and comment on our posts. If you do engage with our content, you might just get a shout out in our next episode as our Witch of the Week. This episode, our Witch of the Week is Hannah Doobie Darby, which is fun to say, who commented on our American Psycho post and said, "Let's go!" I love that enthusiasm. I love being spoken to as if we're at a sports arena. I love the energy. Please continue to match it, Hannah Doobie Darby.
I love it. That makes me feel like I'm in a stadium, and I would honestly really love to see a sports game right now. So like something about like the atmosphere. That's the only time where I'm like, I need a beer. Is that if I'm at a sports game? That's not something you needed to know, Hannah, but like.
I hope you have a nice cold beer, refreshing, if you like beer. If you don't, then you can learn to like it. I did it recently and successfully. So have a cold one on us.
Yeah, or like if you don't drink at all, like a really nice sparkling beverage or like refreshing glass of water if that tickles your fancy, and like a nice little tasty treat. I think like the fun thing at sporting events is like all the food is really nice. Let the good times roll. Let's do it.
Friendly reminder that we're also on Patreon and Substack. You can find all of our links and information on our social media. Please support us. Any contribution helps. Okay, let's talk about the Devil's Backrub. Oh, fuck's sake. You know what? With this film, earlier on today, I said to Mila, who can't be on the episode because she's off sick, but I said to her, I was like, oh shit, I haven't watched The Devil's Jawbone yet. And I thought that was really funny, and like I totally yassified the film title. Like, yeah, The Devil's Jawbone. Like, he's chiseled. Like, I need some cheekbones.
No, but the devil's back rub sounds so nefarious. Can you imagine the clawed hands trying to knead your back?
The devil's back rub. To be honest, I hate massages. So like, the devil's back rub. That is what my new name for massage is from now on.
A good massage is really like life-changing. I have no idea what you're talking about.
It gives me anxiety. Like, stop touching me like that. Nope. The background to this film is it's set in the Spanish Civil War, which began on the 17th of July in 1936 and ended on the 1st of April 1939. So it's 2 years and 8 months and 2 weeks and 1 day. The Republicans were supported by the Soviet Union, and they supported democratically elected government of Spain. And the Nationalists, supported by Nazi Germany, supported the military junta that overthrew it. The Nationalists won and were in power until 1975. That's the kind of background context. So this film is set during that time period. And the orphanage is, as we kind of say in the introduction to the film, the orphanage is harboring children from the Republican side and like the orphaned children, and they're also like storing gold for the cause.
So I watched a video essay on this on YouTube. I watched a couple different ones after I watched the film, and one in particular by Daniel Goldhorn I thought was incredibly interesting and well done. One of the interesting things that he said in the film is how the adult characters actually sort of mirror what was going on in Spain at the time, with Carmen being a representation of Spain. She's a woman who's lost her leg and she's quite literally hobbling and like broken as the country was at that time, and the doctor representing the Republic, and Jacinto representing fascism. And we kind of can definitely see that with Jacinto throughout the film and how he continues to do harmful things. And I don't want to like jump to the end of the film, but from the beginning, you kind of see that he has like this toxic masculinity vibe. He's like smoking, he's kind of cruel to the kids, and he doesn't really care about anything other than the fact that he wants to steal the gold from the Republic Army that the orphanage is harboring. And he also used to be a child at the orphanage, but he has like a lot of resentment towards them. And almost like the resentment is not just from the orphanage, but also from his father being involved in the Republic Army, leading him to being there. And his relationship with Conchita feels like less of one of love and more out of convenience of them both being people the same age who are there. It doesn't seem like he cares much about her, but more like he feels like she sort of belongs to him because she is there, right place, right time, whatever. And like the first bully that we're introduced to in the film, Jaime, is very like fascinated with Jacinto, wants to be like him, picks up his cigarettes after he drops them and smokes them. He's really mean to Carlos when Carlos first arrives, and just sort of picks up on this legacy of toxic masculinity. And I think Carlos in this film, I'm like doing my own stuff now. I think Carlos in this film sort of is a representative of the collective, or sort of some of the political ideas that are represented by different people who were in the Republican Army, such as like socialism and communism, and this care for the collective. Carlos frequently takes the blame, even when Jaime is in the wrong and does stuff to him, like when he makes him sneaks out and get the water and they break the water pail. He doesn't snitch on who told him to go get the water. When they are in the basement and he is fighting back and Jaime falls into the water and he finds out he can't swim, he goes in to rescue him, and he even takes credit for it being his knife, even though Jaime threatened him with a knife. And this like eventually wins over the other kids, and they're able to like form this sort of collective and realize the problem that Jacinto is and how cruel he is, because of their ability to like align with each other and protect each other and also just care for each other. And that's ultimately like one of the big themes of the film. But one of the things that I actually wasn't aware of, that I looked more into after it was mentioned in the film, and I think is probably the biggest theme of the film, is, I'm going to speak Spanish, y'all, so don't laugh at me. Los niños robados del franquismo, which is the stolen children of the Franco regime. And what happened during the Spanish Civil War were children who were of the like men or people who were supported the Republican Army, single mothers, or people who they considered undesirable and who were often leftists, were stolen from their families under a policy in Spain, and over 300 children were stolen and placed with families who supported the Franco regime during this time. And what happened like after the Spanish Civil War was they let go of all of the political prisoners and anyone who was falsely or cruelly imprisoned during this time. The stipulation to it was that all of the people who were involved in the Franco regime had to be forgiven, and you could never bring it up, meaning that anyone who was stolen is unable to be reunited with their families, their correct families, even to this day, leaving like a legacy of broken children and families who are kind of forgotten about and are the ghost of the past. But also, in addition to that, you are also not allowed to try to like excavate the graves of Republican soldiers or people who were executed during this time, because it's also considered to be a recognition of the events that occurred and like a condemnation of the Franco regime. in Guillermo del Toro's other film, Pan's Labyrinth, there's also a single mom who has a child and she's pregnant from a very cruel, like, military leader. And I think, like, once I found out about this practice, I realized the concept of that movie was like, well, what was going on in the movie was like so much more critical because she was basically like marrying him, one, out of like protection, but also like her actual child could have been taken from her under this because she would have been a single mother. So yeah, like, I think that just puts a bit more context to the movie, and like the ideal of like orphans and stolen children and ghost of the past.
That was super interesting, and I did not know about the forgotten children, which is really sad and terrible. It's also quite interesting from the film's perspective because it's obviously like 2001, writing about stuff that happened in the 1930s and continued right on until 1975. So, and if you can't even talk about it, we're really talking about like a repressed cultural consciousness, right, or subconsciousness, and that's quite interesting. And I think there's like color symbolism that's pointed out by A.O. Scott in the New York Times, who says that like there's a contrast between the clammy greenish light that infuses the orphanage by night and the parched orange glow of the daytime. A tonal contrast mirrored by the story, which melds horror and melodrama. By day, we witness the turmoil of the adult world, which is somehow the source of the nightmares that emerge once the sun has gone down. And I think that reading of the colors works well with another analysis, which was written by the BFI, and it's an article called The Ghosts of the Civil Dead. I'm reading now. And Del Toro's narrative echoes the conflict between the two Spains played out in the Civil War itself, the scientific rationalism of the leftist schoolmaster versus the supernatural irrationalism implicitly embodied by fascism. This sophisticated approach chimes with Freud's analysis of the uncanny, in which the supernatural is defined as a displaced or repressed version of the real, but it tends to undercut the Frisian of the horror genre. Like, that's quite interesting when you just said there, because if it's like this whole like repressed history, then I think in the film, kind of egged on by the color symbolism, there is this kind of like sense of repressed kind of, you know, what's been buried, what's been hidden, coming to light. Like there's a secret murder of an orphan, which is like the central plot, the central mystery, and like the film revolves around like bringing that, like resolving that and bringing that child justice, which obviously you can widen out to like what does each child mean and symbolize, and you can argue that the child's like kind of Spain or whatever, I don't know. So yeah, I think that's all really interesting insight and definitely casts my understanding in a different light, or kind of ties some things together for me rather. Also, like the meaning of ghosts in the film is interesting to consider in this film. I think it's definitely a different use of it that we saw in, say, The Sixth Sense, for instance, where that's more about like grief. I mean, that this is about grief as well, but this feels much more political, of course. But yeah, so that quote that's like said at the beginning, which is, "What is a ghost? A terrible moment condemned to repeat itself over and over, a sentiment suspended in time." I think that really, like, what we're talking about here is like history. Mark Commode for the Criterion Collection said, "The critic J. Hoberman has astutely described The Devil's Backbone as an experiment in anti-fascist supernaturalism, a phrase that neatly encapsulates the recurrent themes that haunt Del Toro's work: the ghosts of history, the freedom of fantasy, the imperative of choice, the relationship between the real and the imagined. At its heart lies the conviction that horror and fantasy are inherently political. As Del Toro told Time magazine in 2011, much like fairy tales, there are two facets of horror. One is pro-institution, the other is completely anarchic and anti-establishment. Opening with the question, what is a ghost? The Devil's Backbone equates the legacy of history with the mythology of the living dead, providing a powerful metaphor for the way in which the past informs the present and therefore shapes the future. Within this paradigm, a ghost may be, quote, the tragedy doomed to repeat itself again and again, an instant of pain perhaps, something dead which still seems to be alive. I thought that was a really good in-depth analysis of what like ghosts mean in this film and how it's infused with so much more. Like, it's not just about individual personal grief, like with The Sixth Sense. It's about like a kind of nation's grief and a kind of political crimes and such. But anyway.
I like that we've defined ghosts in all of these, and also that we've defined like the role of children in all of these. And I feel like in this, like the ghost interaction, human child to ghost child interactions goes back to what we were saying when we were talking about the sixth sense, about children seeing things that adults don't. I think that is something Guillermo del Toro leans into, and this, and also in a similar way that Stephen King leans into, about like all the adults in this movie are really dealing with very present circumstances and having to like think on their feet and deal with the situation at hand, and sort of like their country as they know it falling into fascism. Like they have to be in this moment where they can't really be reflective of the past in a way that's useful, or they don't have the same gift of hindsight. Whereas like I think kids are generally shielded from political situations even as much as possible, even when they're in the center of them. Like children who have like suffered through war or suffered through crises, I think are often not given a lot of information, but they are very intuitive. Naturally, children are very intuitive, and I think that they pick up on things that are going on, even things that adults don't realize. And I think that that is what I was picking up on here, as far as like not necessarily in the sixth sense of things, where the child is going to say something that won't be believed, but rather I think that like the child in this was sort of like picking up on the ghosts or the remnants or the great unspoken secrets of this orphanage that even the adults weren't privy to. He knows sort of like a ghost story of like, oh, a child died here, but like there's a lot of like mystery surrounding what happened. And even the ghosts that are made by the end of the movie, because we like in as far as like the rules of like how ghosts are in this world, it's very American Horror Story-esque, of like they died in the tragic place, so they're stuck here and they're going to be here whether you stay here or not. That the children seem to be able to like perceive the ghosts before the adults can, and that he can, I don't know, communicate with them in a way that the adults can't. I just feel like it's supposed to be a commentary on a child's intuition being much greater than we give them credit for, and children being able to understand the emotions of circumstances even when they don't understand or aren't being told the realities of situations. And in this case, it's war or sort of like political upheaval, right? Like they might not be able to understand who the warring factions are or what is going on in their country, but they can sense evil in the adults around them. They can sense sort of like people's intent with their sort of like childlike innocence. I think that that is something that is explored in a lot of Guillermo del Toro things, but like especially here, where I'm like, they know something we don't, or they know more than we give them credit for, rather. And I think that is where the ghostness and the childness come together, especially for a ghost child.
I was going to pick up on a point that Louisa said about the original, well, the quote in the beginning of the film about like how like the ghosts remain there and like they're bound to repeat themselves. I feel like that's kind of talking about how fascism will continue to repeat itself until like the core issues of why it starts and it's talked about are actually addressed. The ghost story in this to me kind of like really mirrors that, because there's like all of this lore and they just kind of think Santi just ran away, most of the kids the entire film, and you kind of get the sense that Jaime is like hiding something from them the entire film, and you see like his drawing where he has the blood of coming out of Santi's head and you're like, oh my gosh, like so he does know something. But the entire time throughout the film, I originally thought that he died when the bomb was like fired and he saw him like somewhere out in the desert and was hiding it from the other kids to protect their innocence because his was taken away by this aspect of war. But we find out towards the end of the movie that he was actually murdered by Jacinto when he is like fights back and bites him on the hand and then he pushes him and his head cracks open. And like his spirit the entire time throughout the movie, he just seems whenever they sort of ask what he wants, he just says Jacinto the entire time, as if like the only thing he needs is this acknowledgement and like this, I don't want to say payback, but like justice for what happened to him. And the only people who are able to give it to him in the end are like the other children. But I think this is why the metaphor of Jacinto as fascism works so well, because in the end, like he is what ended up killing Santi, who's the ghost of what's haunting all of them throughout the entire film. And all that he really wanted was the end of this thing, which was fascism or Jacinto, who is like carrying out all of these vicious things. And also, I thought it was interesting this that like there's also like this huge explosion like there is in Children of the Corn, and I was like thinking about how much fire is used in children's film, and I don't know if there's a significant reason for that at all, but I just thought it was interesting that we had two films today that had like a big explosion towards the end that had to do with the like core plot, but he causes like the explosion that causes children to die, and then him robbing her of the gold and her that he figured out she kept in her leg. It's just like so much of his character definitely just has to do with like this greed. And then when he finds the box, well, the safe that he thought had all the gold in it, and he sees like his childhood pictures, and for a second you kind of think like, oh, maybe there's like more depth there, because you start to see like the brokenness that Carmen talked about, saying like he's always been like the loneliest boy and the saddest boy there. And to me, he kind of is like the personification of how these sort of like nationalist and fascist ideas starts to like develop, because they develop from very broken people in very broken countries where people feel like they're owed something for their pain or their suffering, and they need to hold someone responsible for all the things that they've been through or all the things that they lack. And in his case, he completely blames it on the orphanage. And so he seeks to destroy the orphanage and rob Carmen, even though he knows that they need the goal to continue to support the Republican Army. He knows all these kids are orphans and they're abandoned. They don't have families to go back to, just like him. He feels like he's the sole person who's owed something. And I think that cycle of like continued pain and the feeling that something's been taken away from you from someone else that you need to take back forcibly continues, like especially when it's coupled with like toxic masculinity in the way that we literally see him even kill Conchita because she doesn't bow down to him and apologize for being against him. Like coupled with that toxic masculinity, that violence, and that like craving to have things given to you because you feel like they were taken away by some force or by, as in his case, I think he believes it's half responsible. He is blaming like the Republican Army because his dad died in it. He's blaming the orphanage and all of these people, and he's destroying all of them. Like that sort of mentality that continues to like build in the world, because I think we don't really address these things. It's like the cycle that continues. It's like the ghost that I think is in countries all over the world, because we've all had like economic crises, horrifying things that have happened in our countries that people just don't talk about. And like those things continue to fester over time and build these incredibly divisive and horrifying political opinions that turn into something that they never have to be if we just address them and deal with the ghost head on and like set them free and give them peace.
Wow, I think that's really fascinating, that analysis, and it kind of paints Joaquinto's character a little bit better for me, because I'm always willing to accept like a man doing stupid shit, but like, and selfish shit, but like I was kind of trying to marry like the plot with his character and his motivations, and I was a bit coming up a little bit empty, but that like kind of puts it more in. I really like the idea that he is a symbol. I mean, all the kind of characters are allegories, as you kind of went through, and I think I got that for like the children, but I was struggling to think like why he would turn on his own origins. But I guess it's like symbolizing like how an ideology, like you said, an ideology begins and causes you to turn on your country. So he's in like a kind of cosmic depiction. He's turning on the orphanage and so on. Yeah, I think that really kind of puts it all together. And I do think that it's interesting that he grew up in the orphanage, and it's like him and Santi are like two sides of the same coin of like both of all the orphans there are like isolated and lonely, but and like abandoned, right, because they're orphans. But that's just like inherent trauma with being an orphan. But so it's interesting that like Joaquinto is like, he grows up and his ideology turns him like violent and super entitled, as you've described, but like Santi is just like another depiction of like how ideology and like war affects children. Like Joaquinto is like, you know, they become violent, and Santi is like they're quite literally taken away. Um, and I know that Chris Cabin for Slant magazine talks about how Santi is just like wanting only justice for his murder, and he's just a metaphor for the innocent collateral damage of war. Um, and this film goes into like the effects of like children are used to show the collateral effects of war. Like Cabin also points out in that in Slant magazine that the doctor sells bottles of rum which are infused with the remains of deformed fetuses, right? Like we also have a missile, an unexploded missile in the middle of the courtyard. Like I think there's just this like I'll say what Cabin says. The unifying element is the slow, often cyclical march of time, and though Pan's Labyrinth offers wilder imagery, The Devil's Backbone is just as piercing in its depiction of the psychological and physical wounds that war inflicts on the innocent. And I do like what you said about Carlos also like symbolizing populism, or like kind of the people's perspective. With his, he even says like he's bigger than us, but there are more of us, you know. So I think like there's that kind of, he's symbolizing the banding together Republican war effort there for Spain. I think that's just really fascinating. It's really put it together for me. I think I understand it a lot better after.
I have a comment on the innocence point and then a question about the title. But my comment is sort of about who we afford innocence to. I think using children to tell these stories is like very universalizing, because we can all, for the most part, come to an agreement that children are innocent. They are not pawns in any war, you know, or if they are being used, we can all agree that that's bad. You shouldn't use children in those ways. Like, I really enjoy your point, Tyia, because it does bring a bit of like gray and nuance to like the adult characters who for otherwise could be seen as like pure evil, I suppose. And I think that like conflict like this and people who grow up with a lot of bitterness as a result of like being sort of tossed back and forth in their youth or even young adulthood with war and violence, like it's obviously he's not innocent, right? But I think that like focusing on innocence as in regards to like who we should have empathy for, or like situations we should have empathy for, can be really really tricky to do when telling war stories. And I'm always thought, you know, think back to, you know, in even in modern times when we're looking at situations like Gaza, where we're like, yes, women and children, because we view them as innocent, right? Like men are not considered innocent in these contexts. And then you'll always have sort of like the, I don't even want to say like it's not a devil's advocate, but like sort of like this minority opinion about like, look how men are suffering, right? Because we don't view them as innocent. Like look how men are forced to like suffer on the front lines, and like look how these societies become rotted. It's because we have like denied empathy, we've denied innocence to a lot of people. And like these young boys will grow into men who will then lose people's empathy, right? They're growing up in a fascist state. They are also going to be propagandized. They will lose people's empathy in a couple of decades, right? As soon as they're men. And we will all of a sudden forget the context that they were sort of put in, and we'll forget about the loneliness, and we'll, you know, lose our grasp on that universalizing humanity. So like while I appreciate absolutely like using children to like get hooks in an audience and like make a point for movies like this that are really driving home a message, I also really appreciate these like complicated backstories for the adult characters, for the men, for the women as well, who, right, it's just so easy in horror to have like an uncomplicated purely evil villain, especially somebody who kills a child, right? Like somebody who kills a child is absolutely a villain. But I think, you know, because there's so many dynamics at play here, and the adults are actually supposed to represent like groups of adults or concepts of adults, right? Like somebody's representing fascism, somebody's representing populism, all of this type of thing. I think you have to look at them with more nuance than like adult man bad, child innocent, child good, right? Like this unexploded bomb, and like the message that this, we are doomed to repeat ourselves if we don't learn empathy, if we don't treat people with like the same empathy that we gave to like to like Asante, for example, that like we're again like doomed to repeat history. And that is something I feel like the man keeps trying to tell us. Like in all his movies, he keeps trying to like hammer it home. But I do think that the like fantasy childhood element is the thing that people get fixated on, where they're like, this is who I will resonate with and this is who I will feel bad for by the end of the movie. And I don't think it's as simple as that. And then my question is about like the title, The Devil's Backbone, like the actual they take shots of it that like amniotic fluid. I don't actually know what they're pickled in, those fetuses.
Rum. It's rum. That's why he's like giving people shots to help their impotence. I was like,
Yeah, I've seen multiple different interpretations of like what sort of like imbibing a fetus might mean for like its healing properties, or it's like why is that so central to this plot. I wondered if I could hear like y'all's takes, or if you'd read anything, because I've read some sort of like vague kind of explanations, but none that totally made sense to me as it relates to all the themes that we've been talking about.
To me, like I kind of thought of it as like make of it what you want type thing, because the doctor, when Carlos comes to him and is like asking him if he believes in ghosts, the doctor himself is kind of like, well, if you like want to believe in ghosts, then like you might as well believe this. Men drink this when we're desperate, but like we have to make money some type of way. So like if you want to like buy into that and like create your own reality, then you might as well drink this because it's basically like a placebo. And to me, like it kind of is a reflection of like, I guess like the lies that men tell themselves to like feel like less helpless about their situation. I feel like that's why the doctor like downs a shot after he realizes like something is going on. He's also like kind of scared about what the orphanage is
Well, it's implied
facing.
that he's impotent, right?
yeah. He's being cuckolded by someone who's not even his wife.
Yeah, a lady that he's like in love with. I mean, also gross on her. Like, I get it, girly, you have knees, but ill, that man sucks.
Well, also she like groomed him. So
I did not catch that.
she says something. Well, it's just said that I think he says it. He's 17 when they started. And yeah, I mean, like, obviously she was like there raising him. So I would consider that
I thought
grooming.
the ethics of that was like for sure weird because she like even references like what he was like as a kid, and we know the entire time he grew up there. So it's like that's weird. But I didn't realize he actually said what age it started. The fact that they're able to like sell it to all these people who are in like the midst of a civil war and everyone is obviously hopeless and scared and dealing with their own situations, it's kind of just like drink it and make of it your own reality. Like, yeah, like selling a dream, basically, like selling a dream of whatever you want it to be, it's going to fix it. But especially since it deals with impotence, it's like, it feels like a direct link to like how men feel like they can't be helpless. Like, even the children in the scenario really like pull themselves up and come up with a solution on how to defeat Jacinto and like kind of build their own little rebel army and are going out at the end of the movie into the absolute unknown of the desert with like hopes and dreams. Because they're going out in the desert in the middle of a civil war, which is terrifying for children. None of them are probably older than 12, but they just kind of do it. And I think that's kind of a reflection of like how like men are like not allowed to be vulnerable, but specifically like during this time period, especially, it was definitely not the time where you could be like vulnerable or really cry. And they're also like so hardened by the fact that they've been through war and their parents have died, that like they don't really have anything left in them to grieve. But it just kind of feels like the impotence part is like referencing kind of like a dick swinging contest of like who can be like the most masculine in like the face of fear, like who can really cover it up and mask it the most.
I definitely think that what you said, Zeba, about like men not being considered innocent really marries with your point, Tyia, about like this film and the toxic masculinity. It like questions that it raises for sure. And yeah, the fact that it's impotence does seem a weird castration of sorts, symbolic castration of sorts. And then the fact that we have like dead children shown to us so viscerally, so like unabashedly, is also like giving and we're in like a barren desert. It just all points to like almost like a lack of fertility or a lack of future, really.
Yeah, I mean, the only woman there is like Conchita and then Carmen, and Carmen is well beyond her childbearing years. So, like, the only woman there is Conchita, who's of like childbearing age, and shockingly, Jacinto like claims her. I mean, he is the only person her age there, so that would be a bit strange if it were anyone else. But we do see like throughout the film, Jaime has like a little crush on her, and she's like very soft and gentle with them and very nice to them, which is like a very nice contrast to how insane her boyfriend is. The bomb in the courtyard is also like something that's such a focal point to me of like how they put like ribbons and stuff on it and like play around it and like completely normalize it, but it's like in the room with them in the way that like trauma is, war is, fascism is, the history of this, the legacy of it, like the way that that trauma will be continued to be passed down. Like even if the orphanage burns down and even when they have the massive fire, that bomb is still there. And when Jaime like tells him at the beginning that they're lying to you, saying like it's not active, but it's actually, if you listen closely, you can hear that it's still very much like active and alive. It's sort of like, I don't know, it just reminded me of like generational trauma, because like you can deny that it's there and everything about the situation can change. Like the orphanage can be completely gone, the war can end, but that bomb will still be in the exact same place. And like you can change the things around it, they can put streamers on it, but it's just there. Like it's not going to go away until it's actually dealt with, until it's removed, until it's changed in the same way that trauma is. And so I feel like this kind of the bomb being there the entire time is just like showing how much trauma the children are like dealing with actively at that time, but also the fact that it doesn't end with them. Like it's always going to be there.
I also think the fetus is probably the most mon femme part of it, and that like it does represent a life that had potential of being but didn't. And I think that that is sort of what it's saying. Like, yes, tied to the impotence piece, but they also sort of advertise it as this like fix all cure for all types of things. Like he mentions, like, yeah, people do use it for impotence, but also like they kind of use it for whatever they want. And I feel like the fetus, the womb, the thing yet to be born, the unknown potential for things is like both scary and hopeful in a way. Like these are, right, fetuses with birth defects that were never going to be able to like live, or if they were going to live, it was not for very long, or it would not be a very like thriving life. And I feel like that like uh the potential cut short displayed in a jar like that feels like the scary potential that we're always talking about in like womb type of movies, where like you don't know what's going to come out, you don't really know what monster could come out, but there's also like potential, there's hope, there's like fertility as a concept is just something that is like like we think of springtime, and like like there, it's sort of like a two-sided coin. But I think that it was just like the open spine is just so horrific that it's sort of saying that like, and it's disgusting to think about like ingesting something like that, that it feels like, hey, this thing, this world that you're imagining, this potential for hope, is actually quite disgusting and been corrupted. That's how I interpreted it. And I almost don't like looking at it that way. Like, but I think that is the message of this film. Um, and like the cure all that a political ideology promises to people can actually be this really fucked up, twisted, disgusting thing.
And then I guess like if you're drinking like they are the fetus water, that's kind of a symbolic return to the womb situation, start over again vibe if we're talking it in the mon femme monstrous feminine context, which often talks about reincorporate, like a lots of times we have like reincorporation into the womb or fears of that, whereas these people are willingly kind of resetting it, almost like reset their history.
And in war, when all the healthy men die in war, right, like the fertility of a nation is affected. Like that's why people talk about saving women and children. It's because the women can continue having kids, whereas like when all the able-bodied men die in war, that has an effect on for years to come. Like, that's undeniable. And that's why they moved kids around to different houses, like Tyia was saying. Like, they were all supposed to be a part of this new vision.
I wanted to talk a little bit more about the fantasy point because Mark Commode for the Criterion Collection also says something quite interesting, and he's comparing it to Pan's Labyrinth because obviously there's very similar themes explored across Guillermo del Toro's body of work. But he says that both films balance political tensions with a feud between fantasy and reality, between the way the world seems and the way it is, and both counterimpose the recurrent fairy tale motif of choice against the specter of fascism, the ultimate lack of choice. And both films also centrally feature a child facing a very adult situation and dealing with it from a place of grace or purity. I thought that was interesting because I know when we did Pan's Labyrinth, we talked about it as like escapism, her kind of escapism world. And I just think it's interesting here that again, that idea that fantasy is like choice and like fascism robs you of choice. I thought was just quite a poignant one to make. Not, but I don't think it's as explicit, like as much of a division here because obviously the supernatural element was caused by the like reality of war. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I can definitely see that. I feel like in both this movie and Pan's Labyrinth, they both have like the death of a father figure. We don't know where, or what was going on with Carlos's mother, but like that desperation that both of the kids have at the beginning, he's like holding on to the ideal of like he has the conversation with Jaime, but he's still like comforted by the fact that like the guy who brought him there is still there, and he doesn't like freak out and realize that how alone he is until that guy like leaves him there and doesn't say goodbye or anything. He just kind of like sneaks out. And it's sort of the same with Ophelia and Pan's Labyrinth, where she is like doing everything in her power to make sure that her mom stays like in good health, and she makes the like puts the thing under her mom's bed and gives it her blood every single day and does all of these things because the ideal of her being completely alone without both of her parents is just like very hard to fathom, but also like it takes away like choice to be a child, um in the way that both of them have in this film, and it like creates environments in which they are so self-sacrificial that it almost seems like out of place for a child. Like Ophelia is willing to take a bullet for her baby brother when her stepbrother is trying to shoot the is threatening to kill her. She takes the bullet. And in this film, he allows Jacinto to cut his face to take the blame for the other boys, and they're willing to take on this adult man who they know killed one of their friends and another one of the orphans, to because they're like he has to go down. And like the thought of children making such a big monumental decision, over their life and their agency to create a future in which they have choice is just astounding. And I think Guillermo del Toro is like a genius at making films, I think, that deal with trauma and especially like political themes like fascism in a way that is so artful and with depth and heart and characters that are so much beyond what they represent and the things that are going on in this story. Like you grow so attached to like Carlos and Ophelia and even Jaime throughout the film that like you genuinely feel connected to them by the end of the time you watch it and whatever happens to them. And I don't feel like that happens all the time in films. At the end of Pan's Labyrinth, no matter how old I am when I watch that movie, I always cry. And when I watched this one today, I also was crying because I was like, it's just so like unfathomable to me how fast these children grew up. Like there's these moments few and far in between where you see like glimpses of them just being kids where they're like playing with slugs or something like that, and then the next moment they're doing something like jarringly adult, and that to me is like so horrifying, and that's where like a lot of the horror came in for me.
There's a lot of camaraderie, at least among the boys, that feels very true to being a child. I was always so jealous of like the way that little boys get to be friends. I was friends with a lot of boys at that age because I felt like they had like a very innocent camaraderie, whereas girls sometimes fight, and it made me upset. I didn't want to fight with you girls.
Yeah, they were mean at first for sure, but like also the only like they had been so exposed to like Jacinto for so long that I feel like until they had like a counter of like Carlos just being like kind and like not just like throwing them under the bus and bossing them around, they didn't really realize what like collectivism looked like or like community looked like or unionizing quote unquote looked like. They just kind of were like, "Oh, whoever's the biggest guy, we follow him around and we want to be like him because then you have the most power," instead of realizing that they could share it and then topple over the things that made them feel oppressed or who were cruel to them. So the children doing that I thought was very impactful and sad and scary.
Thank you for listening to the Monstrous Feminine podcast, produced and hosted by Zeba Aurora, Tyia Burnett, Mila F., and Louisa Johnson. Big thanks also go to Sebastian Pizarro for our wonderful theme music. Be sure to follow us on Instagram, SoundCloud, and Spotify at the Monstrous Feminine Podcast, and on Twitter at the MonFemPod. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and Substack, rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and follow us on TikTok at the Monstrous Feminine Pod for podcast clips and more fun. All information can be found on our website, www.themonstrousfemininepodcast.com. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Brooms up, witches out.